All right, so now that we know how the rate of diffusion is influenced by various factors like temperature and concentration gradient and things like that, let's now take a look at how diffusion actually works. So it turns out that there are two major mechanisms for how diffusion occurs, and both of these depend on whether the molecule that is diffusing is hydrophobic or hydrophilic. So simple diffusion is the first type, and it occurs if the molecule is hydrophobic, so that is hydrophobic molecules or lipid-soluble molecules tend to move across the plasma membrane by simple diffusion. Whereas if the molecule is hydrophilic, that is water-loving and is easily dissolved in water, it tends to diffuse across the plasma membrane by a mechanism that's referred to as facilitated diffusion. So let's turn our attention to simple diffusion here for a second. So simple diffusion occurs with substances that are hydrophobic or even some gaseous compounds like oxygen and carbon dioxide. Simple diffusion is a type of diffusion whereby molecules diffuse directly across the plasma membrane. So they can just go right through the membrane, right through that core of lipid tails that's hydrophobic in the center. They have no problem going straight through that hydrophobic core in the center of the membrane and getting directly across in that way. So remember that this is still diffusion. So substances are moving from areas of high concentration to areas of lower concentration. So in this real-life example here, oxygen tends to diffuse from the extracellular fluid across the plasma membrane and into the cytosol of the cell. So cells are almost constantly using oxygen to make ATP, and so oxygen concentration in the cytosol tends to be pretty low because it's used almost as quickly as it diffuses into the cell. The opposite is true for carbon dioxide, as carbon dioxide is a gas byproduct that's made when sugar like glucose is split in order to make ATP. And so it tends to diffuse from the cytosol, where it's in high concentrations, out to the extracellular fluid, where it is typically in low concentrations, because carbon dioxide tends to diffuse into the blood pretty quickly, and it's carried away from that site. And so for this reason, carbon dioxide tends to be really low in concentrations in the extracellular fluid. And so diffusion, the direction of diffusion is typically from the cell to the extracellular fluid for carbon dioxide. A couple of examples of lipid-soluble or hydrophobic compounds include steroid-based substances, and the backbone of many steroids is that lipid cholesterol that we saw earlier in the chapter. Certain vitamins like vitamin A and vitamin D are lipid soluble, and so they can diffuse into the cell by simple diffusion. And certain hormones that are lipid soluble are also able to cross the plasma membrane directly by simple diffusion. So these hormones include things like thyroid hormones and steroid hormones. So since steroid hormones are steroid-based, they have a cholesterol backbone, or they're cholesterol-derived. And steroid hormones include things like the sex hormones, so these would be estrogens and testosterone and things like that. There's a couple of other steroid-type hormones that we'll explore when we get to ANP2, but for now, we'll just focus on those. So now that we have seen simple diffusion, let's explore facilitated diffusion. We're going to see two types or two mechanisms within facilitated diffusion. The first type is referred to as channel-mediated facilitated diffusion, and this makes use of protein channels in the membrane. So with facilitated diffusion, we require a protein channel or carrier, because with facilitated diffusion, these are substances that cannot directly cross the plasma membrane, and so we need this little channel, this little doorway across the plasma membrane, and this doorway or this channel is water filled, and so this substance can continue through this, can diffuse through this water filled channel and never have to interact with the lipid tails of the hydrophobic core that we see inside of the plasma membrane. So as I mentioned earlier, these membrane proteins contain a water-filled channel in its center, and these allow for the passage of small hydrophilic ions or compounds. So these are things like small ions like sodium and potassium, and even things like water move by channel-mediated facilitated diffusion. The channels tend to be selective about what can go through them due to the size or the diameter of this opening or this pore in the channel. And keep in mind too that this process is still diffusion, even though we're using the process is making use of this protein channel structure here. It's still diffusion in that substances are moving from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. So that's channel-mediated facilitated diffusion. Osmosis is the facilitated diffusion of water. So water also moves across the plasma membrane by facilitated diffusion, and this process is usually referred to as osmosis. Special protein channels that are in the plasma membrane that are called aquaporins permit the diffusion of water either into or out of the cell. Another type of facilitated diffusion is referred to as carrier-mediated facilitated diffusion. It's fairly similar to channel-mediated facilitated diffusion because it involves a protein structure that acts as a carrier to move or shuttle substances across the plasma membrane. So this type of transport is used for relatively large hydrophilic substances. So these are things like amino acids and sugars, and so these are considerably larger than the sodium and potassium ions that we've talked about before, and water as well. So water is a much smaller molecule than some of these amino acids and sugars are. The carrier works by binding a substance, or I should say the protein carriers that are involved have a very specific shape for substances, or for very specific substances that they can move across the plasma membrane. And the way that the carrier works is that it binds the substance in question, changes shape, and releases that substance onto or into the other side of the membrane. That is, it moves it to the watery environment on the other side of the membrane here. So in this particular example that you see here in this diagram, glucose is typically moved from the blood plasma, where it is in high concentration, and it typically moves or diffuses into the cell. So glucose is typically at low concentrations or relatively low concentrations inside of the cell because cells rapidly use glucose in order to make ATP. And so glucose is pretty much used up almost as quickly as it enters the cell.